Malcolm Arnold at 70.
The English composer Malcolm Arnold will be 70 later this month. He made his first impact on the musical world as one of Britain's finest trumpet players, but soon switched to a career as a composer, with early success for his film music, including an Oscar for The Bridge on the River Kwai. Arnold's orchestral works in the early 50s won critical acclaim and helped to establish him as one of the great hopes for British music. However, despite the popularity of his early works, Arnold's career plummeted into near obscurity, with 9 symphonies and numerous concertos virtually unknown to the public. It's only now, almost 4 decades later, that his music is arousing interest and controversy once again. Has Arnold's neglect been justified, or was he a victim of changing fashion?
I don't tremendously warm to Arnold's music. I have to say, I don't think much of it will last. But who can tell?
I think he went out of fashion because people wanted to be modern at all costs, whatever the word modern means. But it certainly didn't mean the kind of music that Arnold was writing.
Malcolm Arnold has often been his own worst enemy. He's got blindingly drunk. He's slept with women who weren't his own wife. He's been in a mental asylum. You've got to forget all that crap and just listen to the music.
I didn't wish to live to be 70. And I'm very sad I have to. Because 70 is too old. I wished to commit suicide, which I tried to unsuccessfully on many occasions in Cornwall, which was the height of my happiness.
Between 1951 and 1956, Malcolm wrote music scores for 81 films. If you add all this up, it comes to about 140 hours of music. Now, if you were to take Beethoven's 9 symphonies, 17 string quartets, 32 piano sonatas, considerable body of work, how many hours? 25, roughly. So you see, 140 hours of music is a hell of a long time. And was this the only thing he did during those 6 years? No. He wrote 3 operas, not full-length ones, 3 ballets, 6 concertos, 4 overtures, English dances, sonatinas, sonata, piano trio, arrangements of this and that. Quite a lot of music. All in those 6 years. And I think that had some terrible effect on him.
I did too much. I think all my music, it's uneven. because there's too much. It's uneven, but like the curate's egg, it's good in parts. The only reason I used to do music for the cinema was to get experience conducting. The Bridge over the Little Kwai, I scored all the military band stuff and all the orchestral stuff myself. I'd never had an orchestrator or a amanuensis, and I did that in 10 days.
I think one of the things one must say for Arnold is that he is in many ways a very professional composer, in the sense the sound is very clear. It's not murky. He knows how to put the notes on paper that are going to produce the results he wants. But it isn't quite the same thing as being a great creative artist.
I think Malcolm Arnold had the tremendous misfortune to live through a dogmatic phase in British music. He came to the fore in the early 1950s when things calcified, when composers, if they wanted to get broadcast on the BBC, and to some extent if they wanted to get performed in concert, had to write in one of two modes. Either they wrote cowpat pastoralities, or they wrote brutally ascetic modernism. Malcolm Arnold wasn't into that. He wasn't into either of those. What he was an English composer who was writing in the mainstream European tradition and producing work that was out of phase with the time in which he produced it, but which now, at the end of the century, we are slowly coming to appreciate.
I started at the age of 4. I taught myself the trumpet because I met Louis Armstrong and his wife at the Royal Bath Hotel, Bournemouth. And they said, do you mind if Mrs. Armstrong sits at your table? I said, mine. It's a tremendous honor. And I said, may I have his autograph? Of course, he'll sign anything for you. He'll sign a bit of music. I hadn't got a bit for him to sign, but he just signed Louis on the tea dancing menu. He is my continual inspiration to any music I write.
Well, as you know, he's had several mental collapses and he's had to go away for some months, sometimes years at a time. He seems to be all right now and has for the last few years, but of course he's very heavily on the pills. And he has been looked after by this wonderful minder, John Anthony Day. And Malcolm really is very dependent on John Anthony.
Malcolm! Well, I've been looking after Malcolm for 7 years. Basically, my life is running the house, driving the car, and generally looking after him. Anything that he needs, then I organise and arrange.
That's the nearest table I can get.
Malcolm was pretty ill when he came to Norfolk. They actually said at the time they thought he'd got about 2 years to live. In actual fact, he's amazed everybody. He's made such a wonderful recovery. Fortunately, with Malcolm, he stopped drinking 3 years ago, which is part of the great improvement in his health. He does now stick to fruit juice or non-alcoholic wines or beers.
I drank because of depression, which is an entirely different thing. And at the age of 50, I really thought I had enough of life. It had been enjoyable. And it was Deirdre Ryan who actually saved my life in Ireland. I'd taken I don't know what I took every pill in the house. One day on the bed, and I thought, well, this is very nice. It must be heaven. And when it was Deirdre's face, I said, my God, it is heaven. Because Deirdre in Irish and Scotch means Lady of the Sorrows, and she's by no means that. Cheers. The aircraft hangar was actually the BBC studio in Bristol, where they played my sea chanties for wind quintet. I don't know what the Performing Rights Society pays on an aircraft hangar, but it must be something.
When we were in the London Philharmonic together, that was in the 1940s, he wrote quite a lot of pieces, for instance, the sea shanties. Several members of the orchestra had to go into the army, and he was called up, but didn't stay very long. He also helped a viola player who didn't want to go into the army and didn't want to be a conscientious objector either. The viola player pretended to be mad. Malcolm Arnold put on a very official suit and pretended to be his psychiatric keeper. And amazingly, they fooled everybody, and the viola player was given exemption from the army on psychiatric grounds.
There were many people in the course of my career in the London Philharmonic that I would have willingly strangled or shot through the temple. So I thought I must volunteer. So I did the complete infantry training, and during the end they said, we're putting you in the bus band. There were two who pretend. I said, look, I've given up. I've done infantry training. I tried to get in the paratroops, and I was too heavy. And you tell me I'm going into a band. And I just sat in that deserted room and cried. I had 5 rounds of ammunition left. And I thought, what shall I do? And I went in my best denims, put a biscuit underneath my foot and on the top, and shot it. And there was this resounding bang, and there I was in a pool of blood. There was all this great sympathy for me, because the war had ended by then. They said, you bloody fool, you could have maimed yourself for life. And I was in a hospital a long time and got well. I went back to my usual job as a musician.
I think it's very relevant that Arnold was himself an orchestral player, and I think that one of his aims is to write music that orchestral players like. Well, orchestral players are brought up to do a certain number of tricks, and they don't want to learn any new ones very often. And so a conservative composer who doesn't demand anything very new or any extension of technique is naturally well regarded by players. But then players are very strange. They like conductors with a clear beat, don't cause any troubles, you know. Well, some of the good conductors don't have a clear beat and do cause trouble. They are often the best.
He was a rough and ready musician. He didn't have any of the airs and graces. He didn't wine and dine the right people in society that would have got him the appropriate positions from which he could have been seen as the great composer. He didn't do any of this. Probably when he wined and dined, occasionally he ended up flat on his face, and this wouldn't have helped either. He was not the type of musician to ingratiate himself with the establishment that has always controlled the performance and the broadcasting of British music, and consequently he was sidelined and he suffered for it.
I think when I was a child, I'm talking about sort of 50s now, composers like Malcolm Arnold were writing extremely well-crafted, very touching, very humorous work, but which did not take cognizance, if you like, of the incredible advances that have been made in music. And if you're a person like William Glock, I think you come to somewhere like the BBC and you say, am I going to embrace everybody in one warm Catholic church, all the Arnolds, the Simpsons, the Tippets, or am I going to actually say, this is where I think music is at the moment, the fast white heat of new music, and that is what I'm going to put on. If you do that, you're bound to alienate some people. You can't do everything at one time. And I think probably for people like Arnold, that must have been a rather painful experience. But I think it was a necessary one.
The BBC, together with other organisations, has enormous power, and this comes down in the end to perhaps a few people, because the people who get in charge are the people who actually make the policies, the people who decide things, the people who run things, and their particular tastes and prejudices come out very strongly. This could damage or even destroy careers which otherwise might have been very promising and very successful.
There was certainly an entirely new kind of producer that came into the BBC in the 60s, the young bloods, if you like, and probably the BBC needed it. But I certainly felt a degree of shock on one occasion. I was doing a show in Meadowvale 1 with the Symphony Orchestra, and three of these came in, and we were doing a piece by a living British composer, quite very accessible music, even tuneful at times, you know. And they looked at the score over my shoulder and began to absolutely guffaw at what they thought was ridiculous, passé music.
I don't myself believe in the conspiracy theory. I do not believe that there is an establishment which gets together and makes up its mind about this or that composer and limits the performances of that composer's work this way or that. The cock-up theory is much more persuasive. And I think that in Malcolm Arnold's case, there are some reasons why perhaps he hasn't had the number of performances he deserves. He's a bit of a polymath. He's also a sort of melancholy clown, and the British like to know how to classify people, then they can put them into neat slots and perform in those slots.
The thing is that if you make jokes and put popular tunes in symphonies, I think people think you're not serious. Also, of course, he's never gone in for the hype much. I mean, if he's asked to write a program note, he just says, this symphony is in 4 movements. Whereas if he'd said, now what I'm striving here is, Schopenhauer once said, you know, people take that seriously.
I never know what to say, because if you say serious music, there's no such thing as serious classical music. There is music. There are not two cultures. There is not science and art, as I used to tell my friend Lord Snow. I said, there aren't. You're good and bad at anything. Even sweeping roads can be done well. And it should be. And everything that should be done should be well done. And to sum it up in the most brilliant nutshell that's ever been put by anybody was by Gustav von Holst, who said, if a thing is worth doing, it's worth doing badly.
when I was about 30, I had a piece played at the Festival Hall by the Philharmonia, and the critics rounded on me, and I had some of the most vindictive crits I've ever read. You could get them into the lexicon of musical invective, and the two most pejorative words they could find to beat me over the head with, first one was Malcolm, and the second was Arnold. And, you know, it just completely destroyed any of the self-esteem I had as a composer, and I gave up my aspirations almost on the spot, and I only write for my own amusement now. And to think that Malcolm Arnold has had to put up with that, he's had a really obstinate belief in his own ability to carry on writing through all the brickbats thrown at him, and I can see the struggle that he's had.
The double violin concerto was commissioned by Yehudi Menuhin, and I conducted the first performance at Bath Festival. It was a challenge, because what is there to write after the Bach double? Nothing but mine. Do you know any more double violin concertos for violin, two violins and strings? Well, there you are.
At his best, he's a marvelous composer. Neglected, people think he's a clown, but he's much, much more than that. When Malcolm is at his best, I feel my heart really uplifted. He makes me laugh, and he makes me feel good. I think one of his best pieces is that grand, grand overture that he wrote for the Hofner concerts.
Hofner always used to amuse me. He said, I suggest the biggest symphony orchestra with the organ and 3 vacuum cleaners and an electric polisher. I said, well, where are we going to find out what notes they are? He said, I've all arranged it. We're going down there. And I said, I've got work to do today. He said, we are going to Hoover's place in Regent Street, and you and I've got all the press of London. You and I are going to personally listen to vacuum cleaners and polishers. And I took a tuning fork with me, and I found that they were all in B flat, except the polisher, which is in G.
I have to confess, I don't actually warm very much to Arnold's music, but I don't think one should go on about this. I don't see the point of critics going on about things they don't like. They should shut up and leave it to somebody else who does like it. And fortunately, there are people who like Arnold, a lot more than I do.
The critics used either to dismiss him or just not bother to turn up to the part of the concert that his music was being played in. If it was played in the second half, they would leave at the interval and they wouldn't mention it at all. And it wasn't even just that what they said about his music upset him, that they didn't take it seriously. It was because what they said about his music was personal about him. He thought very deeply about what he was doing. He put a lot of work into the technical part. He put a lot of thought into what he was trying to say. He longed to communicate with people. He thought that was what his work was for. And then at the end of it, when somebody writes about his Fifth Symphony, this was written by a creative personality in an advanced stage of disintegration. I mean, this would distress anybody. This was his soul that he'd put into his work, and that was all that they could think of to say about it.
It was Sir Thomas Beecham who said, "Those who can't criticize, and those who can do." So if you say no can do, you're criticizing everything and you're very insular. And that's not a good thing to be these days, particularly at the age of 70. I was insular enough when I was adolescent, before I mistakenly became a professional composer. I never said this to my brother. The only thing I did say to her, because I suffered very badly from asthma. Without her care, I wouldn't have been alive. I said, well, I don't know why you take all this trouble. I wish I'd died a weakly child. And she used to cry. She said, you'll grow up to be a good musician.
There's absolutely no way that we in this time and age can judge accurately whether Malcolm Arnold is more important than so-and-so. None whatever. And no doubt I and all my previous colleagues and subsequent colleagues will have made fearful mistakes. But I think those are some of the reasons why, if it's true that Malcolm Arnold is neglected, he may be neglected.
I know myself, when I heard the Seventh Symphony on a new recording, I simply had to revise all my preconceptions about him. This was a man with a very powerful message and the means with which to say it. This was somebody who was operating from the centre of the symphonic tradition and carrying it forward. This is the major British symphonist.
We're really a very unmusical household, considering both my parents were musicians. And looking back, I think it was the feeling that it was so precious, such a very valuable thing, that you couldn't have the radio on while everyone was getting on with other things. And he didn't like the idea of records, I think partly because he felt music should be live. The 7th Symphony was meant to be about his family, me and my 2 brothers, and I suppose when I listen to it, I feel I can see my brothers in it, but in the 2nd and 3rd movements. But the one that's about me, although it's very energetic and even violent, I suppose, I think I see my father more in that.
The first is dedicated to Catherine, started in an aeroplane going out to Ischia. And then I heard news of my son in Papua New Guinea, whose life had been saved, oddly enough, by a Catholic nun. I hoped they didn't save his soul, they saved his life. The last one is Edward, who is autistic. And he adores Irish folk music, particularly the chieftains. He said, I'd love to see the chieftains, but it was always too late to take him to hear them. But I hope when he and I are gone, all we hear are the pipes of Paddy Maloney, the Elonian pipes. And that's all I wish of life and death.
Living with Malcolm was a very interesting experience, and it was something that I don't think I'd want to repeat, but at the time there was never a dull moment, because whatever he was it 100%. If he was going to be friendly, amiable, jolly, happy, wonderful, then he was absolutely that, and nobody could have been nicer, nobody could have been more generous. But if he was sad and if he was depressed, it absolutely ate him up, and there was nothing left of him except blackness and misery and total moodiness, and nothing could get him out of it. Nobody could help him, nobody could do anything about it. He got angry about the situation that he found himself in, because his music, he felt, wasn't properly appreciated. When he was feeling particularly depressed, he went off to the pub, which, if you're in a situation that you can't deal with, that you can't do anything about because you're helpless and you're powerless in the hands of other people, it seems to be a very reasonable thing to do.
I've seen him at a thing called the IMA Club, Musicians Club, and I've seen him there eat a meal consisting of 3 dozen oysters, an hors d'oeuvre after that, 2 or 3 portions of meat, sweet, cheese, drinking furiously, and then perhaps, you know, having a quick feel of the waitress afterwards, to say the least. It seemed that everything was gargantuan, everything was exaggerated. The non-drinking was perhaps too heavy, and the drinking and everything else was also very, very heavy. It went from one extreme from another. I would think, but I'm not that sort of person, it sounds a wonderful recipe for schizophrenia.
They all agreed I was an exceptionally interesting case. Is that all? Oh, no, that's not all. Oh, my God. it was in order, so they came to this conclusion. There was no apparent reason, it was functional and not organic.
Mr. Nuttall?
Yes?
What does that mean?
Well, they couldn't find anything.
Oh.
But as I was obviously on the verge of a nervous breakdown, they insisted on sick leave. And peace and quiet.
All my music is biographical, from very first thing I wrote. When I was 21, and I was diagnosed as a schizophrenic, which was a total breakdown. I lost all memory. I was unconscious through overwork. I think it's very distressing for one's relations, one's children, and one's girlfriends, and all one's friends when one is put away. Has it ever happened to you? No, no. I hope it never does, Chris, because I'll come and visit you. A good violin gets better as it grows older. I don't think it's necessary that composers do. What do you think of Richard Strauss's later works from an invalid's workshop? Terrible, aren't they?
I went on a date in March 1988 to the first performance ever of Malcolm Arnold's Ninth Symphony, which is the only time it's ever been done. It was a very strange occasion indeed. Remember that at this time the symphony was already about 15 months old. He finished it in December '86. And this occasion took place in Greenwich Borough Hall. It wasn't a professional occasion, it was an amateur orchestra. It was the orchestra of the National Centre for Orchestral Studies, which has since been disbanded. And Sir Charles Groves took what was effectively a student orchestra through the Ninth Symphony on one rehearsal with about 12 people there, of which I was one. And Malcolm said hello to everybody and then went upstairs to the gallery to be by himself, and the rest of us sat downstairs. And this piece was played, really I think for him to hear it and for a few friends to hear it and to try it through. And the first three movements are pretty standard Malcolm Arnold. I mean, a simple allegro first movement, a sort of pastoral slow movement, and a quickish scherzo. And I thought, well, this isn't nothing to write home about. I've heard this before. Then we came to the last movement, which is, as it turned out, very long, about 25 minutes. It's adagio, very slow throughout. And it comes across as a sort of extended funeral march, as bleak as anything. Whole stretches of just two instruments playing against each other. And at the end, I think we were all completely drained listening to this bleak music. I mean, it has echoes of Mahler, of late Shostakovich. It's a man, I think, confronting death in the face. I'm not surprised, actually, that Malcolm hasn't written very much of substance since, because I think he probably wrote himself out. He said everything that he wanted to say at that point in his life, I think. I'm just praying now for an occasion when this music, which is unique and individual, can be made more available to a wider audience. It seems to me a scandal that this score, now 5 years old, has never actually been performed since. Whatever you think of it, it's a challenging work. It's, in some ways, an eccentric work. But this is a great composer speaking to us of things deep in his heart, and it needs to be heard.
The last movement is meant to be complete serenity. The sparse scoring is intentional, and I wanted it to die away as Mahler's Ninth intended to. This has been reconstructed, but he intended it to die away. D major being the last chord that he hopes to hear. And I added to it, not having just a unison, I did the whole battery of Hollywood Christmas music with D major, celesta, harp, spread, like this. So it's a long chord, held low, and dying. So at the end, there should be no applause, and then you know you've won through.